Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for this panel discussion on criminalizing Islam, the Western European panel discussion. So why are MPAC UK doing this event, criminalizing Islam? The simplest and bluntest answer to this question is that we see normative Islamic practices being used as markers for extremism. What does that mean in plain English? It means that, for example, if a child expresses an Islamic opinion in school, he may be interviewed by police. It means that so-called counter-violent extremism or preventing violent extremism, CVE or PVE for short, these policies single out Muslims when they are applied on a national level. This event is the Western Europe panel and will be the first of a series, inshallah, as we track the spread of counter-violent extremism legislation and its subsequent impact on Muslims around the world. Case in point would be the UN Security Council Resolution 2178, which bound nations to CVE and PVE policies. As a community, we need to realize that we must be alert to the spread of these policies in other countries because they will end up on our own doorstep too. But we as Muslims should take heart too. If we can defeat such legislation in our own countries, not only have we stopped it here, but we can help and train other Muslims to tackle it elsewhere too. The saga begins in the Netherlands thanks to two key documents: Recruitment for the Jihad in the Netherlands, From Recruitment to Trends, and a memo titled Counter-Terrorism in the Netherlands. So we will start our discussion there. Before we start, we have some simple ground rules. The chat function is for any questions, which will be answered in the Q&A at the end, inshallah. The chat is not for provoking or responding to provocation. Anyone who breaks this simple rule will be removed. Questions from our Zoom audience will be prioritized. And if there's time, we will come to questions from our Facebook audience. To join in on Zoom at our next event, book a ticket on Eventbrite and look out for updates on our social media. And lastly, if you want to see more of these kinds of events, join our team as a volunteer. There will be links in the chat. With no further ado, our first speaker is Samira Sabir, based in the Netherlands. She is a practicing lawyer with SLS Juristen and sits on the board of a Dutch mosque committee. She will be sharing the work she has done to reveal the witch hunt against Muslims and Islamic institutions in the Netherlands and an upcoming work she's been doing on Project Ummah. It gives me great pleasure to host her in today's event. Please go ahead.
Brother. Assalamu alaikum. I am Samira, based in Holland. I would like to make use of this platform to explain to you our current case. So I rather have a case study instead of a lecture or a presentation or whatever. The Netherlands is known in the international community as the country that has excessive counterterrorism measurements. Think about administrative control measures that target individuals based on mere suspicion, on the basis of indications that they might pose a threat in the future. Leading to even revoking the Dutch nationality. So we have to do with very broad and vaguely defined laws executed by powers and authorities that are also not bound to any kind of accountability mechanism. So in fact, individuals, let's say Muslims, are subjected to laws that are not divined, or there is no information about possible consequences, or they don't even have effective access to the information. So the problem with the counter-terrorism legislation in Holland is that it's no longer only the threat of violence, actual violence or potential violence, but it's also about anti-integration or anti-democratic or anything that doesn't fit the current social cohesion. So the security discussion has moved from focusing on violence to doesn't fit the Dutch democracy. I would like to go into the case by showing you a short video describing the case we're facing now.
Wat is salafistisch?
Mijn vraag is of u wist dat ze banden hadden met een salafistische organisatie.
Ik moet eerst weten wat een salafistische organisatie is.
Maar ik stel u hier de vraag.
Nee, maar goed, ik moet beantwoorden.
Ja? Dus ik
En
vraag u een
ik
antwoord
moet
te geven.
beantwoorden wat is wat ik niet begrijp. Ik weet niet wat u bedoelt met salafistisch. Is dit dezelfde begrip zoals ik het weet?
Onder andere om politieke invloed, via politieke invloed, ergens binnen te komen.
Wij worden gedwongen opgeroepen als getuigen. En het is alleen moslims.
Dat kan gewoon niet. Hè? Grondwettelijk is het gewoon zo dat we hier in Nederland de afspraak hebben met elkaar. Dat we elkaar niet op religiositeit of kleur of andere kenmerken onderscheiden. Ja, en dat werd hier dus heel duidelijk wel gedaan.
Dus je voelt als een moslim voel je je beperkt in het belijden van je geloof. Maar ook in je vrijheid van doen en laten. En dat je toch anders wordt behandeld als een soort tweede rang staatsburger van dit land.
Het gaat toch over buitenlandse financiering?
Het is niet voor niks dat ik daarnaar vraag. Er gaan natuurlijk verhalen dat er ook tassen met geld rondgaan.
Door uw specialist van afgelopen maandag. Tassen geld met geheime of met privéjets in Zwitserland en dan complete onzin. Ze hadden al een voorgepland eindpunt waarop ze wilden uitkomen. En alle vragen en ook de volgorde van de sprekers en de mensen die ze hebben uitgenodigd, die moesten allemaal bijdragen om op dat eindpunt uit te komen. Hebben ze nu eindelijk een rapport waarin ze kunnen zeggen, ja, dit rapport geeft aan dat er ongewenste beïnvloeding is door buitenlandse financiering.
U heeft mijn vraag beantwoord. U heeft mijn vraag beantwoord. Nee, maar u heeft mijn vraag al beantwoord, dus ik ga u nu een nieuwe vraag stellen.
Ik bepaal of dat ik beantwoord heb, niet u. Ik bepaal of dat ik beantwoord heb, want anders bent u mijn antwoorden aan het afhakken.
Meneer
en dan
Salam.
bent u niet eerlijk met mijn antwoorden aan het omgaan. Nee meneer, ik ben niet in de
Nu stelt
rechtbank.
de heer Schoonis nog een aantal vragen
Ik
over
ben
de
niet in de
financiën.
rechtbank. U bepaalt niet wat mijn antwoord is.
Nee, maar ik ga wel over
Zelfs
de
de
orde.
rechter bepaalt niet wat mijn antwoord is, dus u ook niet.
Nee, maar ik
U
ga
heeft
wel
uw
over
taak,
de
ik heb
vergaderorde
mijn
en ik
taak.
verzoek u nu om mee te werken aan dit verhoor. En u bent daar ook toe gehouden. Meneer Salam, ik
zie alleen
ontneem
maar
u
dat
nu
u
het
mij aan het
woord
overschreeuwen
en ik
bent.
geef de gelegenheid aan de heer Schoonis om opnieuw een vraag te stellen.
Ik zie dat u aan mij...
Ja. Schoonis.
Dat is iemand mond dicht maken?
Waarom wordt de moslims in dit geval misbruikt voor een politieke campagne?
Maar het was juist de Tweede Kamer die besloten heeft om alleen maar de moslimgemeenschap te criminaliseren. Want zo hebben al die organisaties die hieraan hebben meegewerkt of moesten meewerken, hebben zich altijd als verdachte gevoeld. Ondanks dat je dus eigenlijk niks hebt gedaan wat de wet niet toelaat. Maar je werd vanaf dag 1 werd je eigenlijk daar als een crimineel gecriminaliseerd en als een verdachte behandeld ook.
So what we just saw was the parliament. In Holland, it's formed by the first and second chamber, so the House of Representatives, the second chamber, and the first chamber, the Senate. They were led or driven actually by a media article saying that the Muslim community receives money from other countries, and with receiving this money, there could be potentially any kind of influence. The second chamber had a whole discussion about this, and they came to adopt a motion which by law cannot be, of course, discriminatory. it should be a neutral question, but by the context and the setting and the article that led to this discussion, you can understand that it is about the Muslim community. So the formulated purpose of the research was what undesirable influence is exerted on civil society and religious organizations in the Netherlands, such as mosques from unfree countries, and how can this influence be broken through? They just added such as mosques in there to direct their focus on this question, which in fact was a very weak attempt to conceal the target, the Muslims and the Muslim community. What happened is that the Muslim community, the representatives of the Muslim community, think of the biggest mosques in Holland. Their chairmen were summoned to come to the inquiry setting, where the parliament used, or actually misused, the right to inquire, to arrange and organize a parliamentary inquiry under the setting you just saw, you just witnessed, where I think this is important to understand that law. So there's a protocol and there's an act on parliamentary inquiry, which says that the parliament can, if it wants, have different witnesses put forward under oath. So it's a very heavy instrument under the public eye to answer questions they need answers on, to conduct their work. This is an option which they are not bound to use. Seeing the witnesses, so these are individuals, common men, common Muslim men, with their private lives and their own interests, the parliament did persist in the public setting. So this whole event was live streamed, where they were treated as suspects instead of as witnesses to get to their research answers. The individuals, they were chairmen of the biggest mosques in Holland, which were again divided by Salafi mosques and potential Muslim Brotherhood mosques. And this is what happens in Holland, where in the beginning we all faced counter-terrorism legislations on clear violence or clear potential violence and threats. Now the term Salafi or Muslim brother has been criminalized. And the setting you see is as if they are in a court setting without the rights an accused has, you know, the right to attorney, right to be informed, right to not incriminate themselves by not answering, because these people were bound to answer and they were even cut in their answers. It's a yes or no and no further explanation. They had to answer questions that had nothing to do with foreign influence. They had to do with Islam. So as crazy as do you celebrate birthdays? It had to do with a private individual rather than, you know, the undesirable influence or the potential of it. What happened to those people is that the media picked on, of course, this whole setting. This is the second time in Dutch parliamentary history that the parliament used this instrument to come to their answers. I mean, there are less invasive options to get to the research questions. Even if you would discriminate the Muslim community by target only them, you can also do that behind closed doors instead of live streamed. The media picked up on this topic, and they were connecting every individual there with threat, with national security threats, with Salafi as defined today by the politics in the media. There is no actual right definition, as you saw in the beginning of the video, which had direct consequences in the private lives of these people, but also of Muslims as a community. Because you're either a good Muslim, which doesn't show that they are Muslim, There's no external signs of being a Muslim, or you're Muslim as they know, who is not visible. They see you on the streets, but they don't get in touch with you because you're outside of the community. They label you as being a Salafi, or you're visible, you're active, and you're practicing, and you might be a Muslim Brotherhood member, which took a secret oath. It's very, very scary to see the second chamber in this setting. I mean, these are people who represent us asking the questions like they did, which are already very loaded with Islamophobic definitions. Coming to a report at the end, I mean, the whole instrument failed because they didn't get to actual proof of undesirable influence. As in Holland we say, wie betaalt bepaalt, whoever pays decides. They didn't get to prove this. However, they did conclude in their report that yes, there is influence undesirable from unfree countries. God knows what is unfree country except for the definitions they gave, which are Morocco, Turkey, and whoever is connected with the Muslim immigrants in Holland. And they, of course, didn't divine what it means to have influence and what this influence should be. Yet the report is there, and it's a validation on more counterterrorism legislation to target the common Muslim man. What we see is that there is a new law drafted, making it even more difficult to receive funding. And in the Netherlands, the Muslim community lives differently from the Muslims, I think, in the UK, because here in Holland we have second or third generation Muslims. We don't have a big history of generations of Muslims building up their own means and own streams of finances. We are dependent on whatever we earn here and whatever donations we can get from outside of Holland. Think of Kuwait, Qatar, Turkey, and Morocco. So it's a direct limitation on our freedom of religion. Also, what effect it had is that the common Muslim bank client, so every Muslim, every individual uses a bank account. I mean, this is a fact. What happens is that the banks noticed the harsh lines of the government saying that every euro that comes to Holland needs to be checked and needs to be explained. And we need to know the sources of this euro. So they put the banks on the excessive task to do the checks and balances, but actually more the checks to see what and how the Muslim community is receiving money and spending money. There is this law, which is of course neutral and objective in wording, but in practice, it's another Muslim law saying that if there's a suspicious transaction going on, then the bank is bound to research this. In the last few, last years since this event, the common Muslim man received questions from banks saying, why did you buy this hijab? Because I assume they work with algorithms where if you don't answer according to their satisfaction, you're thrown out of your bank. And it's very worrisome. That it worries me to see that so many normal Muslim businessmen are now deprived from their bank accounts, and they don't get to open another bank account because they are listed in some kind of list, a blacklist, as someone with a risk profile, a term we all know from the counterterrorism legislation. We also see that Muslim communities, organizations don't get to open bank accounts anymore. I think it's very important to understand that the counterterrorism legislation is not for terrorism anymore. It's not for violence anymore. It's for anything that doesn't fit the democratic definitions of today and the standards. And talking about unwanted behavior could already fall under the measures that are drafted.
Shukran, Sister Samira, for your comprehensive explanation of how normal daily life for Muslims is being impacted in the Netherlands by counter-terror legislation. And thank you for sharing that video with us of the work that Project Ummah has been doing. We're going to be moving on now to our next speaker, that's Brother Paris Popescu. He is also based in the Netherlands. He is of Popescu Advocaten. He has been a lawyer since 2007, specializing in criminal defense law. He is a very private individual, so it gives me great pleasure to host him today in today's public event. Please do go ahead.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, of course, I'm a kind of follow-up to Samira, and I will add in first instance some of the perspectives that she brought forward. The first thing that is very important to add to her story, because it's a story in which she explained very well, in my opinion, the situation that that reached our parliament, what was a kind of inquisition in modern times to challenge a group if they follow the creed of democratic society, and they make all kinds of definitions if financing from abroad is desirable. And the word desirable, that is of course something else than forbidden. And this is what I think is the most important thing in the whole case, that nobody ever mentioned the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, because there are a lot of verdicts about this subject, because states, they can refuse financing from abroad if it somehow touches their independence. For example, the Romanian Orthodox Church, they would actually make one big Romania, uniting Romania and Moldova. Then a country can say, look, these are reasons which jeopardize our independence, and those are real reasons, and they don't come forward with this in Holland. And I think that the most important observation is that there is a kind of neo-conservative culture going on, in which they see basic human rights and basic principles like the rule of law as an objection to their perspective of governing. And I will give you the principle of the case, that is precautionary thinking. They see after the attacks of 9/11, they're not looking for answers to combat terrorism as a way of repression, making criminal cases, or prevention, stopping crimes, but they do precaution. And let me give you an example that goes first on the introduction. Like you said, if a boy addresses in school, a little boy, an Islamic opinion, then he can be questioned by the police. In Holland, we've seen similar cases. For example, schools learning children Quran. The thought is, if you learn children Quran, some will learn about jihad, some will be explained jihad in a way that is allowed to kill people, some will understand this when they grow up, that they can kill people, and some of that people, when they are grown up, they really will kill people. So that is a very hypothetical question, which is not scientifically researched in any way, but it's a thing where they are staging an event that might occur in the far future. And like this, they are spreading Islamophobia to say that the Muslims will govern Holland and that the democratic rules will no longer apply. And doing so, the government forgets the democratic rules. And let me give you an example, because as you introduced me, I'm a criminal lawyer, but I cannot give you any cases of criminal cases of normal Muslims being criminalized in a court. Why? Because if it comes to a criminal court case in Holland, you have to have proof, and no proof will stick, of course. So a prosecutor is not going to bring somebody to court and look as a clown afterwards. But the problem is that they do it in advance with these precautionary measurements, which do not apply to the role of law because there are such a vague definitions. It's the logic of fear. And it shows in that way that a lot of people, mainstream, ordinary Muslims, they are being affected by it. And the best example that I can give you as a case is a case about the Muslim Rights Watch in Holland. This was a foundation that was funded in May 2020, and which has as a scope, like the name already makes you guess, that it's watching out for the rights of Muslims, the defense of Muslims in Holland. So what happened? This foundation was established. Then there was an application to the Dutch taxes. The Dutch taxes said, okay, this foundation is very transparent. This foundation, it has as a goal to combat discrimination, and doing so, any entrepreneur can give a donation and afterwards deduct his taxes from this from his income. So that sounds very positive, but later on the foundation was put on a list, and they said that the foundation invoked anti-democratic sentiments because it was part of a group that invoked hate speech. And they said that the foundation framed the Dutch government by filing complaints about the discrimination of Muslims against the government. So you can imagine this as a example. You are being put on a terrorist list. Why? Because you are following the democratic legal framework, filing complaints about discrimination. So that's really strange. If a government says, wow, you say that we discriminate, okay, now you have become a terrorist. And that went on, and then we filed a complaint to the court. The question to the judge was, can you please erase this foundation from the list? And then the government, of course, said, we cannot do this because of security. Now, then they asked, what are the reasons for this security? And then they say, we cannot tell you because of security. It must sound very familiar to some people, of course, but this is the way that the government approaches this case. And then afterwards, we went to court, and it turned to be out to be based on news articles. And that means that they just put out some news articles, not about the foundation itself, because the foundation had in the early months a very good track record, filing complaints, sending a letter, for example, to the Minister of Education in Holland, asking more attention in schools for the education about the genocide in Srebrenica, for example, because Holland had also a role in that tragedy. A lot of good things they did. And then they came only with guilt by association. For example, let me give you an example. The foundation was registered at the address, and at that address, another foundation used to be registered. That foundation one time organized a seminary, and there was a speaker. And this speaker had a friend, and that friend sent money to one person, and that one person, he was in relation with a group in Syria, and that group was in relation to Al-Qaeda. If you can no longer follow me, it's not a problem, because it's not easy to follow. But this is the government's logic, guilt by association. And yeah, we said in the court when Nelson Mandela was asked in the interview about by a Western journalist why his grandson was named Gaddafi. He said because he used to have good relations with Gaddafi in that time, because he sponsored the NAC in their struggle against racism. And then they start to ask him about Gaddafi, and then Mandela replied to the journalist by saying, the biggest mistake is that people think that their enemies also have to be our enemies. And this is also the thing which happens in Holland, that there are some Muslims targeted, and other Muslims, if they do not publicly denounce them, they are being part of them. And eventually the court case also very typically ended in a judgment about from the court in Holland, saying that the judge was not able to make a decision because he had no jurisdiction over the case. And that was typically that there are legal boundaries, and every time the legal boundaries are being pushed by the Dutch government, because they use very vague definitions which do not even appear in criminal law, and that undesired behavior is being like a format in which they can push any behavior. And now the most important thing that we have seen recently, like Samira said, are the banks. And as you might have heard, there was also hired an organization to do investigations in mosques in Holland and other religious Islamic centers, to check if people were radical, whatever that might be. But the fact is that they are using private parties, the government, to avoid their accountability. Because if the government says, look, we're going to send one guy every day to the same mosque and to let him talk with the imam or with the followers, the believers there, then later on we can have the complaint, look, you are infiltrating the mosque, the government, and in fact it's an undercover cop going into the mosque without any reasonable suspicion of whatsoever. But if they give this assignment to a private party, then they say, yes, we ask them to do everything in accordance with the law. But if they didn't do that, then that's their problem. And the private party will say, hey, we are no police, we are no government, those rules do not apply to us. And like this is the same with the banks, that the banks have gotten a lot of criminal complaints by the government, so they had to pay very big fines, hundreds of millions of euros, because they were cooperating in arms deals with governments. And now the result is that the people are being profiled by a list saying, yes, if you are coming from Sudan, if you are coming from this country, if you are coming from that country, if you do a transaction, then it's suspicious and you have to have questions. And this is the way, there has been a climate of fear in Holland, and they are using several representatives of the Muslim community to allow those measurements to be put in place. And like I said, it's a completely against the rule of law. And I hope I'm still in the time. So.
Jazakallah khairan, Brother Paris. And shukran for the again, another comprehensive answer. And I think like the key point, the key anecdote that you said there for me was how, as a practicing criminal defense lawyer since 2007, you've never had to take up a case of a Muslim facing these accusations in a criminal court because they know that they would be laughed out of court. So the idea that the Muslims of Netherlands are being used for political purposes, I think that is such an acute anecdote that really carries that point. I'm going to now switch to our next speaker. So here we have Dr. Layla Aitelhaj, based in the UK. She is a director of several not-for-profit organizations that support people impacted by injustice, including Prevent Watch and Nomos. And she is also co-chair of the People's Review of Prevent. She has also been published in Islam 21C, Ceasefire Magazine, and Middle East Eye. It gives me great pleasure to host her in today's event. Please go ahead.
Assalamualaikum. Jazakallah khair for having me on today. I'm going to give a very brief background on Prevent in the UK context, and then focus in on some case studies, because at Prevent Watch, what we do is we support people who have been impacted by Prevent. And to date, we've supported nearly 600 individuals. And so we have quite a rich resource of case studies that we can draw upon when we're talking about the criminalization of Muslims via Prevent. So just to understand, Prevent in the UK is one of the first and most well-developed forms of counter-extremism around the world. I guess every country in the world now has a counter-extremism strategy of some form, but the UK was one of the first and most well-developed. I know that the Dutch beat us to it, but the UK has definitely developed it apace and ensured that they've really deeply embedded it across all sectors. And Prevent is only one arm of what we already have in the counterterrorism strategy, where we have three other arms. So we have Pursue, Protect, and Prepare. But Prevent sits very uniquely in this pre-criminal space. So you are fully thinking not about pre-crime, as the word sometimes suggests, and some people think, oh, pre-crime, that's good because you get the person before they commit the crime. But it's not. Like, the pre-crime space is actually a point in time well before somebody has even had the intention to commit a crime. We're talking about 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds who might do something today that, according to the logic of Prevent and pre-crime, would suggest that they might be vulnerable to radicalization or extremism or terrorism in the future. So, of course, this particular logic has never been evidenced. There's no evidence to suggest that you can do this, that you can predict in that manner any crime, let alone a terrorist act. And what the UK approach really did very early on was it took away the focus from the idea of radicalizers and trying to stop the radicalizers, and concentrating on the people who are vulnerable to the radicalizers. So it's almost like if you're looking at a situation of grooming, which often, extremism is likened by the Prevent lobby to grooming, it would be like taking your focus away from the groomers and looking at the victims of grooming. So that's essentially where UK Prevent kind of has its focus on. And I believe up until about 2014, then Europe, the rest of Europe started to look at it with this lens. So it was looking away from the so-called like soon-to-be perpetrators and was looking at the people who might be impacted by those radicalizers. So with Prevent in the UK, it is now, although it started in 2003 as a policy, since 2015, it has been a legal duty upon all public sector workers to have a due regard to stop people from being drawn into terrorism. So that is all of your teachers, all of your doctors, anyone who basically works in the public sector has a legal mandate to report people who show what they have been trained to think of as signs of vulnerability to radicalization. And essentially there has been a huge number of organizations and individuals and across civil society who have raised concerns about Prevent and about the harms of Prevent. And one of those harms and one of those concerns is its Islamophobic nature. And we have seen evidence of that in cases, and we're not the only people who have seen this. We know many other reports and research have been published around this. There is a solid evidence base showing that Prevent is Islamophobic, including the Home Office's statistics in and of themselves show quite clearly that Prevent disproportionately targets Muslims. It always has. And even though over the years and given the evolution of Prevent, they say now, you know, they target all forms of extremism and include far-right extremism, actually, you're still disproportionately impacting Muslims. Given the percentage of Muslims in the UK is only 5%, Muslims are still several times more likely, even today in 2022, to be referred to Prevent. So I'll give a few examples of the cases that we've had. So there was a sister who started to wear hijab, and she actually had a very good job in healthcare, in the healthcare sector. And once she started to wear the hijab, she went away on annual leave, she came back, and when she came back, her colleagues started to ask her a lot of questions about her religion, which I guess when you first start wearing hijab is kind of normal, because I guess people don't see you as like externally being Muslim. And then once you start wearing hijab, they're a bit more interested, like, oh, you know, tell me a bit more. So they started asking her questions about her religion. And then that developed into asking her questions about her Facebook posts, a bit more about her social media, about, you know, what she thought about the attacks in Tunisia at that time. The sniper attack in Tunisia had occurred. So they were asking her about her opinion on that. And it developed more and more gradually to ask about all her views in all different ways that she couldn't quite understand. And eventually it led to her being referred to Prevent by some of her colleagues. And so she ended up going into a meeting, speaking to her senior, you know, managers who were saying to her, you know, people, your colleagues essentially have concerns about you, that you're essentially what they're saying is you are a future terrorist, right? We fear that you may be a future terrorist. So you can imagine, you know, if you went into work and your colleagues essentially referred you to a program because they thought that you were a potential terrorist, going to be a potential terrorist in the future, how that would impact your relationships at work. And she did eventually end up leaving that role because of the stress that that caused. And nothing came of it, essentially, in that, you know, there were no concerns to follow through with, and the Prevent officers eventually just closed the case. But this did cause a lot of distress for her, and she did end up leaving her place of work as a result. We also have another sister who converted to Islam, and shortly after, not too shortly after, it was a few years after her conversion to Islam, she wanted to get married, and she met a fellow Muslim man online. And you know, given the age that we're at now, you know, a lot of people meet people online. So especially in the UK and other you know, Western countries, I think this has been going on for a long time. So it's nothing abnormal, but this was flagged as abnormal because of the fact that, you know, she'd met this Muslim man online, and she wasn't just chatting away with him or deciding to go on holiday, but she actually wanted to marry him. And this raised a concern, and she was referred to Prevent. And of course, this caused a whole host of issues with her family, who were the originators of the Prevent referral, because of course they were concerned because they they're not from Muslim background. They couldn't quite understand why you would meet this Muslim man online and then you want to marry him, like you've not met him. And then, of course, this caused a whole host of issues once the Prevent officers tried to question her, essentially, and find out a bit more. I can't really go into too much detail about that one because there is a legal case around it. And then there are other signs of increased religiosity that we've seen in other cases. So, for example, there was a teacher who was praying in congregation with some of his students. They were older students, they're in the sixth form, so that makes them about 17 years, 18 years old. And they wanted to pray in congregation. And so he was leading the prayers as a fellow Muslim man in the building. And he was questioned about that. And he was then referred by his employers to Prevent. He was contacted actually during the COVID lockdown, during the first lockdown that we had. He was doorstepped by Prevent officers who were asking him about his views, why was he praying in congregation, and just asking generally why he would have been referred to Prevent. And again, that led to him leaving that job, leaving that role. And then the last example I'll give is of a 17-year-old student who requested some time off. It actually fell within the half term in a way. So he had some time off and then he just requested a small extension of time off so that he could go to Umrah. And he was referred to Prevent. The Prevent officer essentially came in and asked him, even though the school had approved his time off, they came in and asked him all sorts of questions about who he had been with in Umrah and why he decided to go. And when he challenged them, they essentially said, oh, no, we're just making sure that you're going with a reputable company because there's a lot of companies that rip people off during Umrah. It's like, since when did Prevent officers become, the regulators of the travel and tourism industry to check up and just make sure that I'm doing okay and I'm not being scammed by my trip to Umrah, which I've already completed. I've gone and come back with no complaints. So it's just really stupid responses when they find even children challenging them on the basis upon which they're asking them questions. So I guess essentially you might think, okay, well, that's not too bad. You get questioned by Prevent officers. There's no real harm in that, rather be safe than sorry. But this is occurring up and down the country every year in the thousands, at least of what we know. And we know there are many cases that haven't been logged under official statistics. And one of those quite famously came out last year, which was the Fortnite case. And it was a young Muslim boy who had been referred to Prevent because he was talking about the game Fortnite. And of course he was saying, I was in my shed playing with guns and bombs. And instead of looking at that and saying the child's 4 or 5, of course he wasn't playing with guns and bombs. The assumption was, of course he was playing with guns and bombs. Let's call the police. And so the police turn up at his door at 10:30 in the night to check out this shed where this young child is playing with guns and bombs. Now, when we publicized that case, the pro-Prevent lobby came out and said, no, this isn't one of our cases. We checked, this case doesn't exist. So that we always knew that there were more cases that weren't officially recorded in the statistics, depending on where they got to in the pipeline of the Prevent referral. And this just reinforced for us the fact that that case didn't make the official statistics. How many other cases haven't made the official statistics? And what therefore is the scale of Prevent referrals when we're looking at them in the UK? Because the official statistics show about 6,000-7,000 a year, but how many thousands are going without being logged? And this is a really important question to think about, especially in the UK, where you have 5 million public sector workers. All of those are legally mandated to report people for signs of radicalization. And private sector companies are also taking this on as well and training their staff, even though they're not mandated and not required to do so. They are taking this on. So you have McDonald's, Boots, and other companies who don't need to do this, who are training their staff up in Prevent. So yeah, essentially, I guess when it comes to the impact, what this really means, yes, we've seen people leave their jobs because it's become very uncomfortable for them. Yes, we've seen people get quite ill because of the levels of stress that this causes. But there are some real kind of more tangible harms that we see as well in terms of, the majority of PREVENT referrals in the UK, more than half, are children. And when children get referred to PREVENT, more often than not, the children's services becomes involved. So the family can have absolutely no history with social services, children's services, but because now your child has been referred to PREVENT, you will have a social worker knocking at your door asking to assess your family. And of course, the social worker has been seeded with this idea that your child is at risk of radicalization. And therefore, everything they see in your home from, the extensive, like beautiful collection of hadiths that you thought was beautiful is absolutely terrifying to them. They've just walked into your house and your entire wall has books with Arabic text. Like, so all of these things become, and we've seen it in many assessments where they say, yeah, the young child started wearing hijab, and there were a lot of Islamic texts in the room. And yeah, taken by themselves, this isn't a concern, but taken together, all these random points together makes them quite worried, right? So you have involvement of social services. Now, social services can keep your information on their records for at least 25 years. At least 25 years. So imagine as a 5-year-old, you've been reported, social services have come, everything's fine, whatever, they've left you alone. You have a record with social services now that you never had before, your family never had before. So if your neighbor decides that they're gonna, put in a malicious referral or anything like that, this all builds up. And we've seen this happen. We've seen people make referrals off the back of another referral. And like I said, the data tends to kind of add up in their minds. Also, what we see in terms of, because we're talking about data, is data retention on police databases. Now, PREVENT officers are counterterrorism officers. They're not even your bog standard police officer. They are counterterrorism officers. And they have essentially taken your details as part of a PREVENT referral, and it is being stored on databases alongside criminals. Even though you've not been charged or even suspected of committing a crime, your data is now stored alongside all the other data. Even if you're a child, even if you're a 5-year-old child, your data could be stored along there, and there is no distinction between your data as a child, non-criminal, and an adult convicted criminal. So that is quite a scary concept to think about. Yeah, so I guess apart from all of these things, as Brother Paris said earlier, if it is hard to think of anything that has come through the courts because this isn't a crime, right? There's no crime committed. But what that also means for people who have been impacted by PREVENT is it's hard to challenge what has happened to them, right? Because it all occurs outside of the legal space. So it's very hard to challenge and say, oh, this has happened to me and it's discriminatory, because they say, no, it wasn't discriminatory. We would have referred anyone under PREVENT under those circumstances. Or it's hard to then, challenge various referrals or data retention. It has happened, and alhamdulillah, we have had some successes. So there were 2 very high profile ones where children's data was removed from the Metropolitan Police database and other police databases. So that was really successful. It had to go through the courts. But more recently, we've had at least 3 other clients who didn't have to go through the courts, who were able to challenge the retention of their data under Data Protection Act. And they were able to successfully remove it. So these are some of the small gains, but it's really bittersweet because you wonder why you have to put up such a fight and go through all that stress in order to do something that should have never happened in the first place, which is that children's information is sitting on databases with known and convicted criminals. So what does this mean in terms of UK and PREVENT and CVE? I'll just quickly wrap up here, because essentially PREVENT has been described as an industry. And I really think that, if PREVENT is an industry, then the UK certainly is an industry leader. It's the leader of this industry because it is in a unique position with regards to power and politics, being one of the founders of the UN, being part of the EU, RAN, Radical Awareness Network. And essentially, at the moment, what we have in the UK is we're just awaiting for a so-called independent review by the government to be conducted on PREVENT. This is the 2nd review that's happened in almost 20 years. And every time that Prevent has been reviewed or revised, essentially what we've seen is the strengthening of Prevent. We've not seen any of the genuine concerns and criticisms because the UK is essentially exporting Prevent up and down the countries. We see that in terms of the Prevent lobbyists who are, constantly on their Twitter taking snaps of being in different countries, talking about the great successes of Prevent. And of course, there is no evidence to show success of Prevent. And what they tend to do is to suggest that, the success of Prevent and the success of counter-extremism lies in these plots that they've unfoiled. And actually, it's really misleading because plots that have been unfoiled have nothing to do with Prevent. That's a completely different category of legislation that you're looking at, because this is a plot that has been foiled, and Prevent acts way before that time and space. And so I'll actually challenge a little bit the title as my leaving remark, the title of this event, which is, the criminalization of Muslims. And I would say that Prevent, especially in the UK context, and I'm sure around the world, as CVE, is worse than criminalizing Muslims, because at least if you are criminalized, first, you would have had the presumption of innocence. And secondly, you'd be able to fight it based on rights with some, equal measure. But with Prevent, you really can't do that.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Layla, for that, especially the final thought. We're going to have to reword the future series. But yeah, alhamdulillah, the work that Dr. Layla and Prevent Watch are doing, especially with the People's Review of Prevent coming up, inshallah, will become a useful toolkit that can be utilized by Muslims around the world, inshallah, who also have to bear the brunt of the UK being an industry leader of PVE and CVE. I'm going to now swap forward to our next speaker. I just want to point out, inshallah, we have 3 more speakers. We have 30 minutes, inshallah, and we do hope to have a Q&A. So we'll take as long as we need, inshallah. We have such a wealth of expertise here, and we do want to hear them all out, inshallah. But let's also see if we can have some time for a Q&A. We've got comments buzzing on Facebook, inshallah. Let me swap now to our next speaker. So we have with us Brother Ryan Freschi, based in France. He is a legal expert with degrees in human rights, humanitarian law, and child protection. He was a former caseworker for the dissolved Collective Against Islamophobia in France, the CCIF. He is now a researcher for Cage UK. It gives me great pleasure to host him in today's event. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So yeah, indeed, as Dr. Layla said, CVE cannot be regarded exclusively as a set of powers that is criminalizing Islam, and I will try to build on that very good remark, inshallah, and I will try to prove during this quick presentation that in the French case, CVE ultimately led to the establishment of a proper Islamophobic persecution, inshallah. I'm going to start my presentation back in 2015, right after the series of attacks that took place in France, the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, the attacks on the Bataclan. And I'm going to start there because in 2015, after these attacks, the state decided to establish what is called a state of emergency. Now, what is a state of emergency? It's basically an exceptional feature of the rule of law. It's a situation where the state is given exceptional powers that are meant obviously to be temporary, and these exceptional powers are given to the state because it needs to basically protect national security. Now, more specifically, it allows the state to pronounce, for example, house arrests more easily. It allows the state to close down places of gathering more easily, and it also allows the state to organize raids, basically, in a more efficient manner. And the state of emergency was declared in 2015, and it lasted until 2017. And during this span of 2 years, thousands of raids were organized, and obviously, as you can easily imagine, they targeted almost exclusively the Muslim community. We're talking about thousands of raids in basically 2 years. And at the end of 2017, the first step that is essential to notice here is that the state of emergency was supposed to stop. But the French government had the brilliant idea to adopt a specific law which basically normalized the state of emergency. What do I mean by that? Okay, fine, the state of emergency is ended. It's no longer there. But the exceptional powers that are given to the state during the state of emergency were basically becoming part of the common legislation. So now, as part of the common legislation, the state can very easily pronounce house arrest and raids and so on and so forth. So that's the first key step towards the establishment of a proper Islamophobic persecution. So basically, the law, the state of emergency were about struggling about terrorism. Okay, fine. But what they decided to do afterwards was, okay, fine. Can we properly address or prevent what is actually leading to terrorism? And that's when in 2018, they decided, and I mean the government, decided to create and implement a secret plan, a secret public policy, which aim was to prevent, target radicalization. And radicalization in France, and not just in France, obviously, as you know, is to be established through a series of indicators. And these indicators only describe orthodox Islamic beliefs and Islamic practices. So, for example, wearing the beard, not having a mustache, prayer, for example, are nothing but indicators of radicalizations in the eyes of the French state. So they started that public policy back in 2018, and it was completely secret. There's actually, when they started it, there was no document proving the very existence of that policy. And it's only 1.5 years later, back in November 2019, when we actually discovered the very existence of the policy. This is when a Minister of the Interior, the former Minister of the Interior, unveiled the policy and explained that, yes, it was about targeting radicalization, and it was about using the entire legislation, the entire set of powers that were granted to the state in order to obstruct radicalization. So that's an important element to be taken into consideration. Back in 2015, we were talking about terrorism. So trying to use the specific laws that were the specific anti-terror laws. Right now, in 2018 and 2019, it wasn't about the anti-terror laws anymore. It was about the entire set of powers. The entire legislation was to be used in order to obstruct in any form what was called radicalization. Then that specific policy was rebranded. It wasn't about radicalization anymore. It was about targeting and obstructing using the entire set of powers given to the state. It was about obstructing Islamism and what they call communitarian withdrawal, but basically Islamism. And again, Islamism was described through indicators that described normal Islamic beliefs and Islamic practices. So in 2019, that policy was implemented on the entire territory, on the entire national territory of France. Again, in 2020, Emmanuel Macron, who is as you know, the French president, decided to rebrand once again that public policy and said that now they were not going to target radicalization. It wasn't about Islamism anymore. It was about Islamist separatism. And this is basically when he announced the future anti-separatism law that was adopted in August 2021. Now, what's the key point of the anti-separatism bill? It's a huge legal reform whose aim is to give more power to the state in order to obstruct what they call Islamic separatism, which is nothing but Islam and normative beliefs, Islamic normative beliefs, and Islamic orthodox practices, basically. Now, I'm going to wrap it up, inshallah, but I just want to end by giving you the overall results of the policy. And the policy is entirely a systematic obstruction policy. It led to the investigation, the checks of more than 24,000 establishments in France. By establishments, I mean mosques, I mean Islamic schools, and I mean businesses that are run by Muslims. On average, that means that since 2018, 24 establishments are to be investigated on a daily basis in France. That also means that 700 establishments have been closed since 2018. On average, that means that 15 establishments are closed a month. Again, by establishment, I mean mosque, Islamic schools, or any kind of businesses run by Muslims. The policy also led to the seizure, the confiscation of more than 46 million euros. On average, that means that since 2018, 10 million euros are confiscated from the community, which, by the way, is already impoverished, on a yearly basis. So the data, the shocking data, only demonstrates the existence of a state-led Islamophobic persecution right now in France. And it's obviously a huge challenge in here, but what needs to be tackled as well is the fact that France is trying to share its approach, its very radical approach, its draconian approach to other EU countries. It's basically trying to share its approach with Belgium, Denmark, and obviously Austria as well, inshallah. It also needs to be added that France right now is the president of the EU. They took the presidency, and under the French presidency, the EU is co-chairing an institution, a CVE institution, with the very democratic and the very democratic state that is Egypt, right? So it's very clear that France has a very really has a terrible approach, a very draconian approach, and the challenge in the near future is to make sure that obviously its Islamophobic persecution stops in here, and the challenge is obviously to make sure that it doesn't spread to other EU nations, inshallah. And I'll wrap it up.
Jazakallah khairan, brother Rayyan, especially for hitting us with those hard numbers. I mean, since 2018, a Muslim institution is being investigated on average every hour. And knowing, as you've told us, knowing that France is actively trying to push these legislations, these practices to as many countries around Europe as it can, just hammers home, you know, the opening point and the whole purpose of this event and the series, which is that Muslims have to be awake and alert to this threat, not just what's on our own doorstep, but what is being shifted onto our doorstep as well. I'm going to now switch to our next speaker. We have with us Noura Al-Izzeddin, based in Austria. She is a political scientist and co-founder of the Muslim-led Community Response in Vienna, ACTP, assisting communities traumatized by police. She is also co-author of the CAGE and ACTP report, Operation Luxor, Unraveling the Myths Behind Austria's Largest Ever Peacetime Police Raids. It gives me a great pleasure to host her in today's event. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, bismillah, and thank you to all the brothers and sisters who already spread awareness on their specific cases and countries, from France to UK to Denmark, and clearly we can spot patterns here as well, right? So I think it's very crucial, and jazakumullah khairan also for organizing this important, really important panel discussion, because as Brother Rayan just mentioned, the countries, it's a transnational thing, right? So the countries are coming together, coordinating and expanding on CE, counter-extremism, counter-terrorism measures. And so it's about time that the target community, which is not only the Muslim community in one specific country, but actually transnational, is also coming together and is brainstorming here and is supporting and strengthening and empowering each other as well. So yeah, in my talk, I'm going to shed some light on Austria and more specifically on the past year, because what we can basically spot when it comes to Austria is that the past year was one of the most dramatic and remarkable years for us Muslims here in Austria when it comes more specifically to counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. So the measures I'm going to talk about, for us here in Austria, this didn't happen after 9/11, as in many other countries, and I think Sister Samira talked a little bit about it, or yeah. And for us, this actually happened the past year. And the past year, we experienced the largest ever police raid since 1945, since the Second World War. And not only that, but also the Islam Act was revised from 2015, and the Anti-Terror Act was introduced. And not only that, the Islam map, which maybe some of you have heard about, was also published. And now I'm going to more specifically explain actually each measure. And what I want to highlight is as well that it's coming from an institutional level, right? So it's coming from a power position to a minority. So democratically speaking, it's extremely problematic that a state, a power position is like specifically targeting a minority, a religious minority. And I think this is very important to keep in mind when we discuss counter-extremism as well, especially the institutional level of it. So I'm going to start with explaining a little bit the Documentation Center Against Political Islam, which is a state-led, state-financed and state-led documentation center. And it's called literally Political Islam. And this is something we have here in Austria. They use a very obvious, very clear Islamophobic language, not like in each country it's different, right? So we have in France its own specific context, in UK its own specific context, in Austria they make it very obvious that they target us, right? So they literally use Islam in their wording. Like when they introduce the Islam map, it's literally in German, Islam map, and the Documentation Center Against Political Islam. So this state-financed, state-led documentation center was founded 2020 in the summer, in June, I think. And since then, this was a very crucial point for many Islamophobic policies, measures, etc., which were since then introduced. And a few months later on, the largest ever police raid happened since 1945, exclusively, solely targeting only the Muslim community. And not only that, but even crucial brothers and sisters in our community, from activists to our imams, to charity organizations, to academics, professors, everybody basically. And this documentation center played a huge role in that as well, because the so-called experts, which have and we can go more into depth when it comes to that as well, because they do have global networks, right? So they do network as well. And they were writing basically the report for the largest ever police raid. These academics who sit in the state-led and were given the power to basically write a report for the largest ever police raid we have experienced in Austria's peacetime history since 1945, targeting only the Muslim community. These were the same academics who were writing the reports for the largest police raid. And here I want to mention the KHXP report we published a few months ago at the anniversary of Operation Luxor. The Operation Luxor is called this, like the government called, and it already speaks volumes, the naming itself, the largest ever police raid, Operation Luxor. And we have written a report in cooperation, KH and XP. And here we documented first the Islamophobic networks and how they are connected to each other, but also for the first time ever witness testimonies from the survivors of Operation Luxor, from our brothers and sisters who basically went through that and told their stories, including a teenager who told her story, etc. And we documented the human and children's rights violations, including the right to a fair trial, presumption of innocence, Sister Laila also mentioned before, and and also the media complicity in the whole operation as well. So in this context, I want to mention also what the government actually defines as political Islam. Namely, they don't define it. So it's a very ambiguous term. They never defined it. And but we have already seen what they do understand, what their understanding is of political Islam, namely the mere, basic being Muslim, right? So we have seen from the past measures which were taken, they ranged from mosque closures, to hijab bans, to proposed Sharia bans, etc. And these were all introduced under the pretext of so-called political Islam. So even if they never define it, we already know what they mean with it, right? So the mere basic definition of being Muslim, basically. So now coming also to the operation, to Operation Luxor, the largest ever police raids. So I just mentioned that some of its context and the experts, or not even experts, the academics who were basically complicit in writing the reports. And now 1 year later on, alhamdulillah, we can actually celebrate, a success that the brothers and sisters who survived these traumatic raids were fighting for their rights and fighting for justice. And now allegations have been dropped more recently. And not only that, but also the higher regional court actually declared the raids as unlawful, as basically illegal. So basically the government is, and it's not the first time, by the way, that the government is doing something under the pretext of political Islam, and then the court comes in and says it's illegal. So this is a pattern. This is what is happening in Austria as well. So alhamdulillah, the brothers and sisters who are fighting for their rights, now coming to that, the court basically also declared the raids as unlawful, as illegal. Allegations have been dropped. They tapped phone calls because their surveillance which was going on was massively, really dramatic. Also declared as illegal, etc. And when it comes to that, there's also an Al Jazeera documentary just being released a few weeks ago, already hit more than 2 million views, and now the English subtitles are available since I think 2 days. So maybe we can share it in the chat as well. I would highly recommend for everybody to watch. Also, the survivors are here telling their stories, the families are telling their stories, and I think it provides a very, very good insight of the whole operation. And I'm going to be a little bit more quicker. I think my time is running up already. So yeah, and then the third point also I want to mention is the Islam map I mentioned before. So what happened also in the past year was that at the end of May, the government basically / the state-led documentation center against political Islam was introducing a so-called Islam map, which marked more than 600 Muslim associations, organizations, and even published private addresses. So some of the speakers already mentioned that there is a list going on. Some of them, some governments are trying to hide it. Our government is not even trying to hide it. They openly published a so-called Islam map, and not only Muslim organizations, associations are put on there, but even only Muslim marked. Like they don't even need to be Muslim anymore. It's just Muslim marked, and publishing private addresses, etc. And this happened after an anti-racism NGO has revealed data that the Islamophobic incidents are on the rise. Subhanallah. And so I'm coming to an end. I'm trying to wrap it up, inshallah, very soon. I want to shed some light on the Anti-Terror Act, just very broadly. So what happened again is that after the 2nd November attack, where 4 people were killed, A few days later, 9 days later, the government decided to introduce the so-called Anti-Terror Act. And this Anti-Terror Act originally included a so-called criminal offense of political Islam. So we have it again, you know, like they use this very clear language. And they came up with this criminal offense of political Islam. Then 1 month later, the court stepped in again and declared hijab ban as illegal and unlawful. And then the government revised the criminal offense and named it, instead of political Islam, countering religious motivated extremism. And in this case, in Austria, we have the criminal offense. Now it's being passed since the summer. And the criminal offense of religious motivated extremism, as also Sister Laila already mentioned, there is obviously the governments all over the world are spreading fake science, yes, but also in this case, it's not even about violence. It's religious motivated extremism, right? So there is not even the word violence in there. And still, so it's clearly a thought crime, a belief crime, which is now a criminal offense since a few months, or half a year since the past summer. And also this Anti-Terror Act included, for the first time ever in Austria's history, not since the Second World War, for the first time ever in Austria's history, a religious law, because this Anti-Terror Act included also the so-called Islam Act. And this Islam Act was the first time ever in Austria's history that a religious law was passed without the consensus, without the approval of the religious community. And this was the first time ever in Austria's history. And all the political party members approved on that, but one, the right-wing populist party, because they wanted even stricter measures against the Muslim community. So it also gives you a little bit of an insight how, oh, my batteries, just a second. So it gives an insight of how the political climate here in Austria is as well, and its impact on the Muslim community. And now I'm coming to the last point, because I think it's very important to mention here in the panel discussion as well. Last year in October, Susanne Raab, the integration minister of Austria, was holding the first time ever a conference against political Islam. The title was the Vienna Forum on Countering Segregation and Extremism in the Context of Integration, where she invited over 100 experts all over the world, also some of them sitting in the documentation center again, and also state representatives from Denmark and France, so also from the countries who, like the experts from the countries who just spoke. So now they presented a 5-point plan and an ambitioning to put this even more on a transnational level, and ambition to put it even more on a transnational level. And holding now this annual conference annually, and also officially, you know, saying that they want to work together to combat so-called, again, political Islam. So I'm gonna end on that. So I hope I didn't take up too much time. And yeah, Jazakumullah khairan.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Noura, for really dissecting an example of a state using every apparatus, every tool at its disposal to do something that is essentially illegal by the word of the law. And yet, you know, if it furthers a political end, and that political end includes using Muslims as a political scapegoat, then they will do it. This is not an issue that can be ignored. You know, if we leave this issue on our doorstep, then a jackboot will just knock through the door and bring the issue into our own homes. This is not an issue that can be ignored. I must say, Jazakallah khairan to Brother Yasser and all of our speakers for your patience. I realize it is late, but as I said before, we have a wealth of experience and expertise here. And we have with us Brother Yasser Louati. He is based in France. He is a human rights and civil liberties advocate, a community organizer and political analyst. He has been active since the mid-1990s and been a leading voice against racism and state authoritarianism in Europe and around the world. After years of grassroots activism and international campaigns out of Paris, Yasser founded the CJL, the Justice and Liberties for All Committee, which is a transnational human rights and civil liberties organization. Yasser is fluent in French, English, and Arabic, and is a regular contributor to international news outlets such as the BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, TRT, among others. It gives me great pleasure to host him in today's events, and he will help bring the discussion portion of this event to a close as he summarizes the situation across Europe, inshallah. Please, brother, go ahead.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thanks to all the speakers who spoke before me. All the analysis that we have been hearing so far has been spot on, and we have gathered so far a wealth of information in terms of how the law is mobilized to not only criminalize Muslims as potential terrorists or radicals to be watched over, but also to how to redefine what it means to be Muslim, and for Western governments, the UK, France, Belgium, Austria, etc., to further shrink the space in which they evolve and operate. Now, of course, we can speak hours, especially in the case of my country, about all the specific legislation passed to specifically target Muslims, the banning of the banning of Muslim visibility through various laws, the headscarf, the full face veil, the tracking of Muslim girls wearing long skirts, etc. Just before me, we spoke of the state of emergency. The ballpark figure given is around 4,000 raids, if not more, and 0.16% of those raids led to actual investigations on terror grounds, which means that it's not about effectiveness. And the answer to that is the objective was actually given by Gérald Darmanin in late 2019 when he said it's not about prosecuting them, it's about sending a message. We know we have nothing on those people, but it is about sending a message. And of course, every single time there is a terrorist attack, Muslims are held accountable for it. But the questions we never hear, and this is again, I'm been repeating myself, for years now, how come there is no auditing of the failures of domestic and foreign intelligence? There is a wealth of documentation on how French counterterrorism has failed. The same applies to the US, the UK, etc. But instead of confronting state failures, minorities are held accountable in order not only to shift public opinion from seeking accountability, but also to further legitimize extreme laws of repression. So we heard, of course, the SILT law of October 2017, which turned the supposedly exceptional state of emergency into permanent law. There has been almost a year-long controversy around the anti-separatism bill and now the anti-separatism law. But given the way France legislated against its Muslim segment of the population and how it has led, or it has actually developed an access with Belgium and with Brussels and Vienna in order to crack down on so-called political Islam. Now, of course, political Islam has never been clearly defined. And if you take a look at how it is applied, it means any Muslim person who is actively challenging the government, or any Muslim the government disagrees with, whether you are socially active, politically active, or if you dare to speak as a Muslim and of course dare to say no to the government. And we see that this is not isolated to the major capitals of the European continent. Of course, the UK was mentioned earlier, but the same thing is being applied in Denmark, the Czech Republic, in Slovenia, of course, Hungary. And the brutality with which Austria cracked down on its Muslim population, and we remember the raid faced by our brother Dr. Farid Hafez, that has led to the ransacking of his house and the terrorizing of his wife and kids. We only have to ask ourselves, since 9/11, 2 decades have passed, and the drift has been ongoing for 2 decades, and we did not see any stop in this exceptional legislation. cage was set up in the aftermath of 9/11 and the Extraordinary Rendition Program, and other organizations were set up, the CCIF, for example, to name a few. Now, after 2 decades, what is the conclusion of what has been accomplished so far? And I'm going to be quite blunt, and I remind our listeners here, those who know me and those who don't, I belong to no political party. I am not financed by any other organization. What I do it for free, which means I am free to say what I think is the truth. I am not held by any political agenda. My sole objective is to uncover the truth and to promote justice and equality for all. Like it or leave it, my speech is free, and it might be shocking sometimes to say the blunt truth. Now, after 2 decades, we have seen Muslim organizations assess, call out, and expose government injustices and open repression against Muslims. The Muslims today are the Jews of yesterday. It is acceptable to say it today. It wasn't just a few days ago, but now that white people in the left are using it, maybe it is acceptable that the rhetoric being used against Muslims today is no different from that was being used against Jews yesterday. The enemy within was first applied to the Jews, the Judeo-Bolsheviks, etc. Today, the enemy within are Muslims. If you quote the former Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls, he spoke of Islamofascism and a war against the enemy within. Now, we cannot, on the one hand, call states racists, openly Islamophobes. We cannot, for decades, year after year, constantly call out a specific law, constantly witness a drift to the far right, to the point that ideas that were on the fringe of the political spectrum all throughout the European Union, and now after Brexit, the UK, those theses were always considered traditionally extreme. Today, they are part of the mainstream. I remind our listeners that today I've seen the banning of the headscarf in France in schools, that in 1989, the highest administrative authority, the Council of the State, le Conseil d'État, actually ruled in favor of those grade school girls when they were wearing the headscarf. And the Council of the State stated clearly that you cannot discriminate between students. But notice how within 15 years, those who were on the fringe of the political spectrum became the mainstream within 15 years. Now, we are 20 years after 9/11. What happened? The worst is still to be expected. I remind our listeners and viewers that France, as the Bosnians were undergoing a genocide, stood with the Serbians. And when Bill Clinton confronted François Mitterrand about it, while Bosnian Muslims were facing a prohibition to buy weapons to defend themselves against the paramilitary troops of the Serbs and the Croats, what did François Mitterrand say? And what did the British say at the time? It is unfortunate, quote unquote, but this is the painful return to normality in Europe, that Bosnia, a Muslim country, does not belong in the heart of Europe. When you have governments witnessing the butchering of thousands of people, a genocide in Srebrenica, and you see them not only preventing those populations from defending themselves and at the same time actually being okay with their slaughtering, what else can be expected from those governments? So yes, honestly, it is our responsibility as public figures to tell people what ought to be heard, that it is not going to get better. And the reasons, of course, are, multiple. There is, of course, a need to further strengthen the grip of the state over its population. And because they cannot say, well, we need to surveil everybody and snoop on their conversations, we need to pass a law on mass surveillance to crack down on Muslim terrorists. That's what gave us in the US the Patriot Act, and that's what gave us the law on mass surveillance in France, passed in 2016. the state of emergency was unimaginable. But because the rhetoric adopted was constantly to protect the nation from these radical Muslims who are posing a dire threat to our identity, our culture, and our security, etc., we need a permanent state of emergency. So it has become normal for Muslims to be portrayed as the enemy within. Once laws are passed in the name of fighting a specific minority, the law applies to everyone. And as our respective countries, be it the UK, France, and other countries throughout the European Union, are facing potential violent social upheavals, governments in all these countries, they are passing these laws to actually further strengthen their legal, their repressive apparatus. And because they couldn't pass that against the majority population, you pass it against Muslims. Now, the common denominator that I have witnessed throughout either the UK, France, Denmark, and other countries is that oftentimes this repression is not done ex nihilo. There is always a transmission belt between the policymakers and the Muslim communities. And the transmission belt, well, are Muslim organizations. Why? Because in the case of France, when you have, for example, the CFCM that was okay with the very idea of the anti-separatism bill, and even was okay with the idea of having a contract, the infamous Charter of Imams that would police what can be said and cannot be said in mosques. That means that oftentimes mainstream Muslim organizations are the validators of these anti-Muslim policies. And this raises the question, how come these organizations still find a way to represent Muslims without a backlash within Muslim organizations? Now, of course, we do call out governments because they are anti-Muslim. We call, racisme d'État in French, state racism in various countries. We get that. We have the colonial legacy. We have constant anti-Muslim controversies, feeding the hysteria bubble on social media, etc. Yes, but we have to also be blunt with ourselves. Why are they doing it? If you ask someone why, and his answer is because I can, the problem does not lie with him. The problem lies with you. Because if the French government, if the British government, if the German government, if the Belgian government, and now if the Quebec state are racist because of their colonial legacy, but they're only targeting Muslims or disproportionately targeting Muslims. Why is it so? It's because it is easy and there are no political consequences or no political repercussions to what they do. They don't target other minorities. They do sometimes, but most of the time it is Muslims who are being targeted. Why is it so easy to target Muslims? And what else can you expect from a racist government if not racist legislation? Now, the pushback cannot be in terms of the legal struggle. I am not dismissing the legal work. It is fundamental. We need to have the same work that has been done by various organizations, what Sister Lelia has introduced in terms of following up with cases and victim support. But remember that politics is making the legal space shrink, which means as time passes, the surface on which you can actually work as lawyers, as counselors, etc., is diminishing year after year. What TNI based in Amsterdam called the notion of shrinking space. So that means you can not only count on lawyers to do the legwork in terms of victims support. Remember that the law is always political and the law always reflects the power struggle in the halls of parliament. In most of our countries, we have two chambers, the lower and the higher chamber, and whatever the majority is, the law will reflect and will be an image or a mirror image of that National Assembly. So if we dismiss the political work and only count on the legal work, we are heading straight to the wall because they will constantly pass new laws. And as the brother from the Netherlands, mentioned, they will always find ways to criminalize without going before criminal courts. And that is not new. In the case of France, one more time, during the colonial repression against Algerians, Pétain, excuse me, I forgot his name, the head of the police, Maurice Papon, excuse me, who was head of the police back then, knew that if he were to prosecute Algerians through the court of law, it would take him weeks, if not months, if not years. So what he mobilized was administrative justice. And because the administrative justice will always, or most of the time, side with the government, it would be much easier to curtail people's rights. Now, we spoke of the governments and we spoke of Muslim organizations, but now let's look downwards how this repression against Muslims is working. I was shocked some years ago when I would travel to Eastern Europe to see how the UK and France have inspired those countries. And because of the weight of France and the UK in the UN and their supposed legitimacy in terms of speaking of human rights, minority rights, the rule of law, etc., other governments say, well, if France can do it, so can we. And that is the legitimation through the shining example of France as being the cradle for human rights. Now, I cannot take more time, but I have to wrap up. So we have now a definite tendency swooping across Europe. And please do not keep your hopes up in terms of seeing governments backtrack on policies that have been designed for the past 2 decades. Things are only going to get worse. Now the question is, what are we prepared to do as human rights activists, civil liberties advocates, members of civil society to confront that? As long as it is not in the interest of respective governments to backtrack, they will not do it. And this raises the question on how Muslim communities function, both at the national level, but also at the local level. I was shocked when I became familiar with the British Muslim landscape to see how imams were cooperating with the British government to implement the prevent provision. I was shocked. Honestly, I thought, we had it bad in France, but even in the UK, you would see imams that would shut the door to organizations, confronting anti-Muslim policies from the government, but they would welcome state officials and then act as their mouthpieces, join the military, report a person who is a radical, even though the radicalization, of course, has never been defined. And this will join, actually, I'm gonna throw a stone in the, in the showcase in terms of the functioning of Muslim organizations. What we have seen so far, and the French example should actually scare minorities all over Europe. When you see that the Grand Mosque of Paris drafted the most radical version of the Imam Charter, the so-called contract that would allow, or actually that would delimit what imams can say during their sermons. You can't call state Islamophobia. You have to praise the military. You cannot import foreign conflicts. And this is a direct reference to the occupation of Palestine and the Palestinian people's struggle for freedom. That did not come from the government. That came from the Grand Mosque of Paris, the historic organization representing Muslims. Now, call me a radical if you want. That's your problem and your choice. But a question, how is it that Muslims can complain about these institutions who throw them under the bus and still go to those mosques? How is it? Because the legitimacy of the Grand Mosque of Paris, well, it's a mosque in Paris. It cannot, by definition, represent all Muslims throughout France. yet it is the prime institution towards which the government goes to validate its policies. The question is, how do Muslim communities function when there is no transparency, no accountability towards Muslim leaders? The Grand Mosque was not alone. The CFCM itself has been the validator of anti-Muslim policies since its inception, 2003 under Nicolas Sarkozy. And this again now brings the question of who represents Muslims. A sister before me from the Netherlands spoke of Dutch Muslims of the second, third, and fourth generation. It is the same thing in France, okay? It's a relatively new community. Explain to me how, after 3 generations, the representatives of Muslims are still foreign nationals. Explain to me how people who were born and raised in countries where there is no separation of religion and state, where Islamic institutions are there to validate and legitimize the dictatorships that are present in most Muslim countries, with a very few exceptions, okay? Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, where you have some form of free and fair elections, but all the rest of them are under tight dictatorships. How come Muslims in the Netherlands, France, maybe the UK to some extent, are still unable to have their own homegrown representatives? This is not a call for discrimination. I'm talking about the political culture adopted by many Muslim representatives, where in Muslim countries, the imam, the mufti, the preacher, whatever, is always subservient to the king, the rais, the president, whatever. And I forgot who mentioned the case of Egypt. The case of Egypt now presiding an institution that's going to now oversee counter-radicalization. Egypt that has been ruled by a dictator for the past almost decade. And I ask myself, what is it that keeps people so apathetic that they can, on the one hand, say the state is racist, witness the transmission belt of the state being their own Muslim organizations, and then allow people who are not legitimate to represent them to speak on their behalf? What if tomorrow I went to the UK or the Netherlands and I tell you guys over there, you know what, I'm going to represent you. I'm going to learn your language, spend some time, and then I'm going to represent you. What are you going to say? Yeah, sir, we like you, but please stop, don't do it. You are illegitimate. And in the case of Western Muslims, you have to ask yourselves, how is it that there is no accountability, no transparency? And this brings us to the funding of mosques in Europe. A person before me complained, and this is not, throwing stones at her. I highly respect what she said, but I also express my disagreement when it comes to foreign funding of European mosques. Of course, I am not opposed to it for the same reasons as Western governments. Absolutely not. But when a foreign country funds a mosque, that means they have their say in how the mosque is managed, in what imams preach. And that means at the end of the day, how the mosque will represent or not the local community. Now explain to me, if a mosque in the southern suburbs of Paris is funded by the Kingdom of Morocco, don't you expect the Kingdom of Morocco to use that mosque for the purposes of promoting its own foreign agenda? Of course. Algeria, for example, the ambassador of Algeria last year declared the Grand Mosque of Paris is first Algerian. First Algerian. And at the same time, this organization says it represents French Muslims. And the list goes on. So what I call for, and Muslim communities around Europe are going through what other communities went through in the past century and the century before it, they also have to self-organize. Brother Ryan spoke of 46 million euros that have been seized by the French government for the past few years. Right, now, 46 million euros have been seized. And to this day, there is not a network of solidarity, a network of representation, a network that could organize Muslims from the grassroots up. Now, to finish, and I know I've been taking much of your time, and I really appreciate you listening tonight. Western governments are bound to continue these policies. It would be a lie to tell people, expect the better, we are going to fight. No, the tidal wave has been brewing for the past 2 decades, and it will only get worse. The anti-separatism bill has only normalized the wildest dreams of Islamophobes in the late 20th century. Now it is accomplished. Muslim organizations have been acting as the transmission belt. So Muslims have not only to confront governments, but also confront their own organizations. It's not sufficient to say, well, they don't represent us. Oh, yes, they do. They represent you, and they will speak on your behalf. The other one is, of course, a better functioning of the grassroots. Don't aim for something national. Begin to act locally. This is where you will see immediate results. Now, in my case, some fatwas were issued because I organized the local Muslim community, and by mobilizing voters, the socialist mayor, who was quite corrupt, was brought down. And the first opposition we faced, it was the local mosque, the local imam, who mobilized people against the organizing of Muslims at the grassroots level. So there is really questions to be asked. The last point, and I'm going to end here. These events cannot remain talking, or chat rooms. They have to lead to something concrete. They have to push people to leave their comfort zone and engage with one another. Muslims complain a lot of lack of representation or betrayal by public figures. Fine, but can you organize people who don't trust one another? Of course, it is impossible. And as long as Muslim communities allow others to speak on their behalf, and as long as they expect political charity from the government, unfortunately, they were gonna go from bad to worse. And of course, the best is yet to come. For Muslim communities are no different. It's just a matter of better organizing and existing politically. Thank you for listening.
Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Yasser. I want to pick up on that quote that you mentioned near the start about sending a message. Well, the individuals that you've heard here today, and especially Brother Yasser, they are sending a message, of course, to the government and the politics and the parties that all have a stake in legitimizing the institutionalization of Islamophobia. But as a summary of this event, you could also say that we are also, each of us, sending a message to our own communities, exactly as Brother Yasser said, in terms of we are fed up with the misrepresentation of the Muslim community in them being a conveyor belt for the continuation of Islamophobia in our communities. And really, ultimately, exactly as all of the speakers have said here, accountability is key. Accountability is the linchpin which allows, which, when pulled out, all of this falls apart from the government's point of view. When these cases don't even go to criminal court because there is no crime being committed. It's the pre-crime space, as was said, but also accountability in terms of our own communities and those who dare to say that they speak for the Muslim community. Each of us here as organizations, if we are not being welcomed into the mosques to help defend the Muslim community's rights and to help fight back against this institutionalized Islamophobia, then does that mosque have your best interests at heart? So that is the thing that I would want each audience member to take away. Try and, if not us, these organizations who have been speaking with you today, if you can't get us into your local mosque, then consider, does your mosque have your best interests at heart? It is now 9 p.m. UK time. I'm very sorry, but we don't have time for a Q&A. I thank every speaker who has stayed on with us. With the most grateful. Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah reward you with better. We will end the live stream there.